It's week 9 of 2022. I'm Smitha Nair. This is your weekly fix. On Tuesday, a 21-year-old Indian student, Naveen Shekharappa from Karnataka, became India's first casualty of the war in Ukraine. Naveen was a fourth-year medical student at the Kharkiv National Medical University. His death has filled the thousands of other Indian students, many sheltering in bunkers in the eastern part of Ukraine, with dread. Evacuation efforts were still underway at the time of recording this podcast. As the Russian attack on Ukrainian cities continues, over 870,000 people have fled the country, Reuters reported. The death toll is expected to be high. Meanwhile, the United Nations General Assembly, 141 of its 193 members, voted to reprimand Russia over its invasion of Ukraine and demand that Russia withdraw its military forces. India, just as it had at the UN Security Council, once again abstained from voting. What explains New Delhi's position? What is Putin's endgame? Let's ask Nandan Unnikrishnan of the Observer Research Foundation's Center for International Relations. Nandan looks after the Eurasia program of studies. Thank you for speaking to us here at Scroll.
You're welcome, and thank you for inviting me.
I want to begin by asking you, how did we get here? Can you give us the nut graph of events highlighting how the USSR broke into 15 independent countries and the shaping of the security architecture since, for Russia on the one side and Europe and US under NATO on the other?
The process of the breakup of the Soviet Union began in the late 80s, 1980s, and was primarily driven by internal circumstances. But at the same time, the Soviet leadership then, President Gorbachev and his close associates, felt that a reduction in the tensions between the Soviet Union and the West would help address, take attention, or rather redress the issues that were challenges that they were facing inside the Soviet Union, give it more bandwidth, if you want, or more attention. And initially, it appeared as if the West was responding positively. And as a result of that, you had German reunification. You had a variety of arms agreements that were arrived at. So it appeared that there was at last literally peace going to break out in Europe. But however, some of these commitments that were made to each other between the United States primarily, but Europe and the West and Russia, or Soviet Union at that stage, unfortunately were not put down on paper. And because they were not put down on paper, that became the source of tensions between the successor state to Soviet Union, Russia, and the West at large. And the story then, of course, shifts towards the expansion of NATO. The first step there was the denuclearization of the former Soviet states, essentially Ukraine and Kazakhstan, which was achieved by 1994 when both Ukraine and Kazakhstan agreed to transfer their nuclear weapons that were deployed on their territory to Russia.
Okay.
In return, of course, this was guaranteed by the US and Russia and others. The promises were that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of these countries would not be impinged on, and that, that was it. Let's put it like that. Subsequently, in the NATO started considering expansion, and it wanted to include some of the Eastern European countries. The Russians voiced their protest. In fact, General Lebedь had attended one of those meetings with NATO, and he voiced a very vehement protest. However, Russia at that stage was too weak to do anything about it. And it witnessed in waves the expansion of NATO till the point where even the Baltics, and the Baltic countries have a direct border with Russia, were included in the NATO and became NATO members. The holdouts were Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova and Belarus, of course. So now Russia repeatedly in 2007, 2008, and subsequently also raised this issue. But the West still felt that Russia was weak and was unlikely to do anything except, voice these opinions in various fora. But President Putin, I think, and this is where the West miscalculated, President Putin for the past couple of years has been very seriously raising this issue. And in July last year, he wrote a long article. Now, we can argue about the veracity of his understanding of history, but the point he was making is that a non-neutral Ukraine was not acceptable to Russia in security terms.
Okay.
In other words, if NATO came to Russian borders, Russia would feel threatened, and therefore he was proposing that a buffer zone be created, which would be neutral, which would not house weapons of either side and offensive weapons of either side, and would pledge political neutrality, political and military neutrality. There was no question at that stage of, I mean, he did not touch upon the question of economic ties, but obviously Russia would also be interested in having close economic relations with countries like Ukraine and Belarus. So that is how we've arrived at today. And I think it would be fair to say that the lack of response from the West to the issues that were raised by Russia has resulted in this war. I cannot, under any circumstances, condone any war. I mean, whether it is launched by Russia and whatever the justification is.
Right.
But the fact is that there was a build-up to this, and I would say that the United States particularly has an equal responsibility to try and pull these chestnuts out of the fire, because this war is not about Russia and Ukraine. This is a confrontation between Russia and Europe for rewriting European security arrangements that came about after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And since the United States underwrites most of European security, obviously this is a conversation between Washington and Moscow.
Right. So you're saying the war, the invasion of Ukraine obviously cannot be condoned, but that in strategic circles, this was seen as coming. In fact, Western strategists had over the years warned against NATO expansion. Can you explain India's approach to the crisis and the two votes of abstention at the UN Security Council and at the UNGA? What are India's calculations here? We, of course, know that Russia is India's most important military supplier. What are the other factors?
Yes, absolutely. You see, India faces multiple challenges. There are the huge internal domestic challenges, 400 million or nearly so of poor people who have to be lifted out of poverty. But there are also significant external challenges. And the most recent one is the belligerent rise of China. And that has turned to be the most important challenge right now, external challenge that India is facing.
Right.
And obviously, if China is your main adversary, then you are going to look for allies that will balance China, that will add to your heft. So India naturally has started not just drifting, but consciously moving towards a significantly closer relationship with the United States. This has been happening over a period of many years, ever since we got into the negotiations on the nuclear deal, and has resulted in the whole construct of the Indo-Pacific, the rejuvenation of the Quad, which is comprised Japan, Australia, the United States, and India, and generally trying to promote greater cooperation amongst the states in the region to ensure greater transparency as well as enhance security, not just of navigation, but general security of all states in this particular region of Indo-Pacific. But India also faces significant challenges on the continental shelf. In fact, our confrontation with China right now is on our northern borders. And if we look at Eurasia, I mean Asia and Europe, and if the challenge is to prevent a rise of a belligerent hegemonic China, then it is quite self-evident that we will need Russia to be in this project, as it were, because Russia occupies territorially a significant part of Asia. B, Russia would be an important economic and military player who would ensure that as long as Russia stays out of the clutches of China, who would be able to also balance China in the Asian continent. So for India, both in that sense, both Russia and the United States are critical partners. And in fact, Russia has become even more critical in some ways, not vis-a-vis the United States, but in Asia, because of the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan.
Right.
So for India, this is actually, given this strategic challenge, it is not a choice to choose between Russia or the United States. And India is therefore adopted and exercised the third option, which is also a choice of not picking those two sides.
Right. I came across this comment by a historian, Srinath Raghavan, who was responding to a piece in the print entitled India's Abstention on Ukraine Resolution Risks Its Democratic Stature Before the World. He said the following: "This overwrought piece is a useful reminder that the language of strategy and interests is usually reserved for analyzing the actions and choices of the great powers, while the action of morality and principles is deployed for the rest." You tend to agree.
Wholeheartedly.
Having said that, though, can India continue to maintain or walk this balance? We're seeing this invasion resulting in more deaths. Not to forget, an Indian student has been killed in shelling. Isn't there a moral imperative here?
No, definitely. It will make things a little bit more complicated. The Indian leadership will have a literally domestic minefield of public opinion, as well as internationally, which it will have to sort of exercise very nimble sort of dancing on this tightrope. But you see, the external challenges will still not change. I mean, merely because the situation in Ukraine becomes a little better or a little worse, one way or the other, it does not significantly change the challenges that India faces. A. B, being a bit of a cynic, at the end of the day, the resolution to the Ukrainian problem lies more between Washington and Moscow arriving at an accommodation. Maybe Russia will have to make significant compromises in the current situation, more than it anticipated. But the point is, unless they arrive at accommodation, Russia views itself as existential war of literally trying to thwart the enemy at the gates. So this is a very difficult situation, and India should hope that better sense prevails all around, and the conversation between Moscow and Washington comes to a conclusion very quickly.
Ms. Unnikrishnan, how does the position that India has taken affect New Delhi's relationship with Washington, with the United States?
Well, if you look at the various statements, even today, the United States has said that it will continue to engage with India, UAE, and all these who abstain. The United States, after the vote, said that it understands that India has a distinct relationship with Russia. The significant part, of course, what our media is not really highlighting is that, I mean, one of the people who is in the same, one of the countries in the same boat as us, it's not China. Is China, but is also Israel.
Yes.
So I think those of the commentariat who want India to, get off the fence and make a choice and all that stuff, would not think that being with Israel is being in bad company.
Okay, and how do you view the Russia-China friendship? Surely this has implications for India.
Oh, yes, of course. It is a matter of grave concern for India. Given the ferocity with which the Western countries have responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I think here the Russians also did not anticipate the kind of unity and severity of firstly, the unity amongst the Western countries and the severity of the sanctions that have been imposed. Russia may have to lean more on China to sort of balance some of its economic interests. And that would be a very, very delicate operation for Russia to ensure it maintains its independence while increasing its economic interactions with China. And for us, that is extremely important because if Russia, becomes what I would call, or what people are calling, a junior partner to China, then of course Indian dreams of playing a significant role on the Eurasian landmass and all that will be significantly dented. And the choices before India would be significantly reduced.
Yes. And you would say this is a factor in how India is responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Yes, undoubtedly. I mean, we are concerned with the growing relationship between Russia and China. After all, if you go back to the 60s or even the 70s, when we signed our treaty with Russia, one of the reasons for signing the treaty with the Soviet Union, I mean, not Russia, with the Soviet Union, was to balance China and to keep it out of any skirmishes we have with Pakistan. And to that extent, it succeeded. So the Russians have been an important, in that sense, balancer for us vis-a-vis the Chinese. Russia's support at the United Nations Security Council in terms of exercise of their veto and exercising their heft to support India is also there. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russians have been very supportive. Even recently, when China took India to the Security Council on the Kashmir issue, the Russian position was very clear. So, there is still much that India can benefit from in its relation from Russia. Okay. And again, we don't have to go back too far in history. In 2020, soon after the Galwan incidents, the first contact with the Chinese was established in Moscow, when their tensions were at their peak. And that is when the process of de-escalation in the relationship of the tensions between India and China started. So Russia will not mediate, but they would definitely try and reduce, provide a platform for India and China to meet and discuss issues. And they would like to see, since both are strategic partners, they would like to see a reduction of tension between India and China. But of course, that is not something is necessarily in their hands.
In conclusion, what do you see play out? What is Putin's endgame?
I doubt it. I doubt anyone understands how Mr. Putin's mind works. There are several possible scenarios. But one thing I'm fairly certain about But anything can happen. But I would be willing to take a bet on that Russia is not looking at long-term occupation of Ukraine.
Okay.
So it is not planning to add Ukraine to Russian territory. So therefore, if you start on that premise, then the scenarios are, limit themselves to some extent. So I would imagine that one scenario that's possible is regime change and installation of another government that is more friendly or at least neutral towards Moscow. Or even maybe the Zelensky himself, if he is willing to accept and push through this whole concept of neutrality of Ukraine. Then the other option, of course, is that the Russians may limit themselves by expanding the regions of Donetsk and Lugansk, which are being held now by rebels, to their internal administrative borders in Ukraine. Because right now the rebels are holding only about 1/3 the territory that is administratively assigned to these two regions. So maybe they will just expand them to their natural borders and keep that. Because that will also, to a large extent, ensure that NATO does not allow for formal membership of Ukraine. However, part of Russia's worry is that despite the fact that Ukraine was not part of NATO even today, but there were several, NATO specialists, particularly US, maybe not NATO, US specialists and US special forces on assignment in Ukraine, training the Ukrainian troops, providing them with specific equipment. So the Russians were already worried about that, and that was what added to their sense of insecurity and feeling of a threat. So maybe they will do that, destroy military infrastructure across Ukraine, making it totally inoperable, and then restrict themselves to holding some chunks of Eastern Europe to ensure that there is no future development on the NATO front.
Well, meanwhile, these cold strategic calculations of war are resulting in death and destruction and untold misery for the people of Ukraine. For the moment, thank you, Mr. Unnikrishnan, for aiding our understanding of how we got here.
Thank you so much, Smitha.
Thank you.